I want to welcome you all today. We're going to do things just a tad different. Jim and I are going to kind of tag team as far as sermon is concerned here today. We've done this before. It's been a while since we have done this. But here's something I want to share with you. I was a minister in Abilene, Texas when I first started out in the ministry, and I actually started as a youth minister and eventually was the lead guy at that church. But there were a couple kids in my youth group that there was two sisters and a brother. And they had an older sister who already had graduated high school when I started. But one of the things that is their dad used to be the preacher of this little church, and he had through some kind of like family health problems. Males didn't live past the age of 50. And it was all a heart defect and so on like that. So Don Vespremi was the guy's name, and he had several heart surgeries. And after a certain little while, they basically said, we're going to try one more heart surgery, but here's the reality. If you don't have this, you're going to die. And if you have this, you will most likely die on the table. And so one Sunday, he got up basically knowing that he was going to have surgery that week, and this would be his last sermon that he would ever preach to a church. And when I was there as the lead guy, somebody gave me a little cassette tape, and it was actually a cassette of Don's last sermon. And it's been probably over 20 years since I've listened to that, but yet it still resonates that what would I do if this were my last sermon? What would I say? And so what we're going to do here today is we're going to look at Jesus' last sermon. Actually, in John chapter 13 through 17, Jesus preaches his last sermon to his closest followers, knowing that that night he would be arrested. So we're going to kind of dive in here today. We're going to kind of just go back and forth a little bit, and we're going to look at some of the items that really kind of just pop off the page. So I'm going to let Jim kind of dive in here.
So what I want to ask you guys to do today, the last sermon of Jesus is really from John chapter 13 through 17. So if you guys have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to John chapter 13. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles like this located in the seats and right there in front of you guys, and you guys can go ahead and get that out. You can actually have it. We want everyone who comes to worship with us to be able to get into the Word and to dig in. So if you are using one of these, it's going to be on page 900, and you can turn there. That's where we're going to be starting today. And looking at the words of Jesus, you think about what would be the last thing that you would do or last thing that you would say if you were talking to the people who were closest to you. And on the night that Jesus was arrested, what he does is different than what you would expect. In John chapter 13, starting in verse 1 through 5, it says this: Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This is fascinating stuff. The last night of Jesus' life, before he went to the cross, he gets his disciples together, they eat, they end up taking something like what we're taking here in communion a little later on. But then he doesn't sit there and talk to them about all the stuff that they needed to fix. He didn't sit there and warn them. Later on, he'll get into some things, but instead of starting with words, he starts with an action. He takes, he sits down, he wraps a towel around his waist, and he starts to wash the disciples' feet. I was just talking with a guy here just a few minutes ago. What are the implications of that? What does that look like? Now, if you've grown up in church, you've heard stories about how this works and why this matters. You've heard about washing disciples' feet and how in the first century things were disgusting. I actually heard a guy say one time that if you were to hop in a time machine and if you were to take somebody from the first century and put them in a time machine and fly them here to today, the thing that would be hardest for them to adjust to would be the noise of the modern world. That it's noisy all the time, there's lights, there's noise, it's just constant sensory overload. But for us, if we were to hop in a time machine and fly back to the time of Christ, what I was told, and it really makes some sense, is that the hardest thing for us to adjust to would be the smell, right? In the first century, they didn't have toilets like what we have, and so there were animals going down the streets and doing their thing. When you would go and do what it is that you do, anyway, you guys get the picture of what I'm trying to say. You would do it in a pot, and then what would you do with the pot? You would take it out. You dump it on the street, right? So it was disgusting. You're walking with sandals. This is what's on the ground. It's great for soil if you're trying to plant stuff, but it's not necessarily great on your feet. And this is the world that the disciples were in. And so when they sat down that night for dinner, Jesus washing their feet was something that the disciples couldn't handle, right? The very first thing that they see is this man they've been following for 3 years, that they say is their Lord, that they say is their hope, and now he is washing their feet, washing the disgusting stuff off their feet, to the point where if you look at right there at verse 6 of John chapter 13, it says, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered, what I am doing you don't understand now, but afterwards you will understand. And Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I don't wash your feet, you have no share with me. Why would Peter say that? I think in order to understand the context of everything we're about to talk to, we have to understand why Peter said that. Why did Peter say, you don't get to wash my feet? When he's been saying to Jesus the entire time, whatever you want, I'm going to do. There is something inside each one of us who finds ourselves trying to separate our deepest, darkest, most disgusting, disturbing things from everyone else. And for Peter, he knew that his feet were disgusting. He knew that Jesus was bigger than that, and Jesus shouldn't be touching these things. These are gross. And when I see that, I can find myself relating. When I see that, I start to see myself in the feet of I guess it is the feet of Peter. I start to see myself in Peter's shoes saying, I don't want to have my deepest, most disgusting, disturbing things in front of God. I love coming and getting to worship here and getting to do this. But in the times when I know that I have sinned, I find myself, just a few weeks ago, I found myself worshiping God. And then when the full implications of my sin started to come into my mind, honestly, wanting to just get up and walk out the back door. Because I was so disturbed by the fact that God was looking at me and he knew all of these things. But what Jesus says, starting this night, is really profound. He says, if you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part in me. You don't get to keep these things from me, Jesus says. He says, you don't get to just try and clean yourself up and make it better and then come to me. You don't get to do this. Jesus says to him, this is the method. This is the way. This is how it's going to work. And you are not in me if you won't let me have it. If you won't let me wash it, then you're not in me. And for me, that's profound, right? That sets the tone for the entire night. Jesus then goes on here a little bit later on and says, now, not only that, but what I have done for you, you have to do for others. You will wash each other's feet. You carry these things together. So he's setting this idea of going to him and allowing him to clean us and then walking together in it as well, working together towards other things. And I really think looking at this, that sets up the entire thing, right? That sets up the entire passage. But as we go forward from that, Jesus then talks about, now that you are clean, you're in my kingdom, stop worrying. As we've talked about this, I want to ask you, what does that look like? How does that work then if we're in it?
Here's one of the things as you were talking. I'm just going to say, we sometimes have a hard time letting Jesus be Jesus in our lives. Yeah. I mean, that's reality. So I'm going to look at one verse here real quickly from John chapter 14. I'm going to kind of fill in the blank. Now, when people think of John chapter 14, oftentimes they immediately go to verse 6, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And we love to beat people up with that. and Jesus didn't bring that to us in that context. Let's look at verse 1. In verse 1 it says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. So Jesus knew at this moment that his followers were about ready to enter into the greatest period of unknown over the next couple of days. Yeah. And even after that, after Jesus would go up into heaven to be with God, after the ascension, again, there would be a lot of unknown. And so knowing that, Jesus says, Don't let your hearts be troubled. And it's not the only time he says this in these chapters. Actually says it again in chapter 16. Don't let your hearts be troubled. I think Jesus knew that whether it be unknown or whether it just be life, our default mode is to go to anxiety, stress, and worry. And that when things get a little bit tight, when things are a little stressful at work, when things are stressful at home, we immediately go to anxiety. We immediately go into worry. And so in their period of unknown, Jesus says, don't do that. Don't go into this freak out mode. And I for one, I get this because my mind is constantly going and it's constantly firing. And so when something happens, I tend to go into freak out mode in a nanosecond. And so this is relevant to me, but what is even more amazing is Jesus doesn't just say, don't do this. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Jesus actually gives them a command that is not baseless. In fact, as he goes on to talk, he goes, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And so basically what Jesus is saying is your basis for not freaking out in this world is that I am going to prepare something for you in the next world. That this world is not all that there is. And in fact, when he says this right here, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. This is not something that we stand on the street corner and say, all these other religions are wrong. This is Jesus saying, listen, I've got a remedy for everything that is going on in this world. In fact, for me, this is one of those things that as a pastor, little self-disclosure, I get people's the best parts of their life. I get to be there when babies are born and marriages and graduations and different things like I get to be there for the celebrations of life, but I also get to be there with tragedy. I get to be there when the diagnosis is cancer. I get to be there when people die, and I get to walk with people through that. And not only that, how many of you feel like there is just a whole lot of, I'll say this in a nice way, I won't use the C word, junk in this world? That constantly we are getting all kinds of voices and all this junk perpetually, whether it be through media, social media, the news, just everywhere, there's negative. But here's the beautiful thing that Jesus is saying, and I'm going to say it in this way. If you can think of the best day here on earth, it does not even come close to the worst day in heaven. That there's all this going on, but this stuff that is going on in our world, whatever today is, there will be days that there will no longer be days like today. That these things that are happening in this world don't get the final answer. So I'm going to kind of transition into one more here today, and then Jim is going to close us out. I want to look at John chapter 15. John chapter 15 is one of those that especially speaks to me. And what we did is we read through this and we came back together and said, okay, top two. So we're just going to kind of do our top two here today. But it starts with this, Jesus saying, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, what's interesting here is that Jesus, in 8 verses, uses the word abide 7 times. So there's this imagery of the vine, but there's also an imagery of residency. In fact, I went to my little word book that I have, and a lot of times when you go to the original language, it says this word means this. And so it's like this one word means this one word in English, and it kind of goes that way. But this is what the word abide means. It means to continue, to dwell, to endure, to be present, to remain, to stay, to stand, to tarry. So there's this idea that Jesus is saying is that I just want you to focus all of your attention in just being connected to me, to abide in me. And so really what abide means is this continual connection to and dependence on Jesus. And I think he says this is because he knew this. Number one, we will try to do it on our own. That we will say, okay, I know I need to follow Jesus, and I need to do all of this stuff for Jesus, and he expects things of me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this apart from Jesus. I'm going to do this on my own efforts. It's kind of like Peter saying, I don't want you to clean me. I want to clean myself. I want to do this on my own. And I also believe that what happens here is Jesus also understood that we would not just try to do it on our own. He would also take this idea of understanding that we will try to make it Jesus and, or Jesus plus, that we'll try to add things on there. And so that's one of the things that I have found. In fact, we had talked earlier in the week, and the question was posed, what does it look like to abide? What does it look like? And for me, I can look at this and say that there's a couple of items that I know that in a small way, I know I'm abiding when I'm focusing in on making sure that I have my time every single day before I do anything else to spend with Jesus. That I'm in the Bible, that I'm in prayer, that I'm journaling, that I'm even just meditating. I know meditating doesn't have always it has some other connotations, but meditation is just guided thinking. And so just having that thought, and I see correlations when that's going on in my life. I see correlations that my attitude changes. I'm more aware of temptation. It's not that temptation goes away. I can tell it in my language because sometimes I can have a potty mouth when I'm tired. And so I can tell it in there. And so I can look at that correlation. But also, I'm gonna share this before Jim goes into his part here today. Some of you, if you would have known me 30 years ago, would not have probably expected that I would have been a pastor. In fact, if you go back to Beukelman, Kansas, and go up and down the streets and try to find people who know me, which probably won't be very many people because I've been gone for a long, long time, but if you were to go there and ask them, do you know Brandon Shaffer's a pastor? And there would probably be some of them who didn't know would go, yeah, right. And that was not the trajectory of my life. And in fact, I'll even go as far as to say this, that if you would have known me even in high school, there were a lot of people that kind of joked that I would one day be Senator Shaffer. I mean, it was kind of a joke, but I was heavily into politics. In fact, politics was my life. And even the very first part of my ministry, I could look at, and if I went back and looked at sermons, which I don't want to go back and look at sermons, I was probably more passionate about preaching my political party line sometimes than I was Jesus. And one of the things that I figured out, the longer that I abide in Jesus, it's not that politics do not matter. It's not that I'm uninformed. It's not that I won't have a good conversation about it at times. But our minds have got to be filled with something, right? We've got to fill our minds with something. And if we're not filling our minds with Jesus, it's going to be filled with something. And so if you looked at my life at that time, it would have been all politics, and drudge report. So you know where I lean, right? And so it would have been all in that. But one of the things that I came to this realization many years ago, that Jesus, what he is saying right here, is that you abide in me, and Jesus has to be everything or he is nothing. That our goal in life is to not make people, and I know that this is going to stretch a lot of y'all, because sometimes we're more fearful of being bad Americans than we are bad Christians. Amen. But sometimes we are more passionate about making people better Americans rather than better Christians. And the reality is Jesus is saying, I want you to abide in me. And if you abide in me, all of those things that you expect that you need to do and you need to be, I'm going to develop that fruit in you. So the whole idea here is that first and foremost, most passionately in our life, it has to be Jesus. Not Jesus in my own efforts, not Jesus in my own abilities, not Jesus and whatever it is that we want to make it out to be, our church preference, our pet projects within church, other things that we want to make it just has to be Jesus. So we're going to finish with Jim, and he's going to dive into, we're not going to be able to look at every chapter and every verse here, but he's going to dive into part of John chapter 17, and let's say put on your seatbelts, enjoy the ride.
It's only because this passage is so powerful. What Brandon just said about really abiding in him, and this is the connection that is required, I think really speaks profoundly into what we're about to talk to. So turn to John 17. In John 17, what you see is the last thing that Jesus prays for the church before he gets up to go to the garden to ultimately be arrested and to be killed, rising on the third day. But the last thing in the last sermon that he does, he starts to pray, and he prays first for the disciples. But then in verse 20, Jesus prays for us. He prays for you and for me. If you are a follower of Jesus, he says this, I do not ask for these only, talking about the disciples, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one even as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may be perfectly one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and love them as you love me. Jesus stops and he starts to pray for those who would hear the truth. That is you and that's me. And he says, I pray for them that they may be united as one. He says, so that the world may know that Jesus came from God. He says that our unity is ultimately what's going to point towards the fact that Jesus is who he says he is. It's the message of hope comes in that. I find it fascinating that the prayer that he prays is not one of for us. He doesn't pray, I pray that these people who are going to come would understand my word. He doesn't say, I pray that these people who are going to come would be really, really, really nice people. He doesn't say, I pray that these people who are going to come would be very strong and very outspoken. And he doesn't pray, I pray that these people who are going to come would be the best husbands and the best wives that they can be, that they would be the best parents that they can be. These are all things that Jesus desired for us, but his final prayer for us was for unity. How many of us, if we're honest, we look at the world around us right now and we say, this world is going to hell and it's got to change because it's falling apart? Right? We look at the world and we say this world has to change. How many of us believe that the message of Jesus is what's going to change the world? Amen. What Jesus says right here is that in order to get the message of Jesus to the world, we have to be united. That's what the prayer was. He says that we have to be united, and I picture what that looks like. What does it look like to be united? It looks like worshiping him together. It looks like forgiving other people. It looks like honestly just coming together and putting away our shame and our selfishness and our fear of being exposed and naked spiritually in front of people and just worshiping God boldly as one body. I was really convicted about this here just this last week because I remembered something that happened in November. I was in the men's Bible study and I got to talking and thinking about something that God showed me in November that I want to share with you now. I was at a conference in Dallas, a ministry leadership conference. There were 3,000 of us ministers and ministry leaders inside this church, and we're listening to these speakers speak, and it's always so great. It's like preaching to preachers, and so it's really deep stuff and good stuff, and you get fired up. And there was a guy there that was speaking. His name is David Platt, and David had been given about 30 minutes to share. And he got up and he started talking, and he started sharing about the message that he was supposed to share on. And as he was talking, he just stopped. And he said, look, I know that I'm supposed to talk about this, and this video is going to go out, and other people are going to watch this, but I just can't right now. He said, because I just got back from South Korea. And when I was in South Korea, what I was struck by, now just so you understand South Korea, 100 years ago, there were 10,000 Christians in South Korea. Now there are millions. There are millions of people worshiping Jesus in South Korea. The Word of God is living and active, and that place is on fire. So just if you keep complaining about the fact that the church is dying and nothing's happening and God's not working, it may just because we're here. He's working there. You see, these people were worshiping God, and David Platt, he started talking about what God was doing there and how he went into these house studies, and these people are just falling on their face, and they're calling out to God, and they're crying out to God, and he's like, and I look at us, and as Christians in America, we just don't do that. And it's partly because we're afraid of being ashamed. It's partly because we're afraid that people are going to look at us funny. We don't want to do that. And he started talking about that. And then he talked about a professor of his that he had that was there and had come back. And the professor said he was at a hotel one night at like 3 a.m. He heard this stadium going crazy. And he's like, what kind of sports are they playing at 3 a.m. that people are going nuts? And so the next morning, he went down to the front desk and he asked the guy there, what was happening? What sport are you guys playing that they're yelling at 3 a.m? And he said, that was the church. They got together and they were worshiping God, and they were yelling together at 3 a.m. And so David Platt says to us, picture this, 3,000 people in ministry leadership, and he said, maybe that's what America needs. Maybe we need to start worshiping together and calling out to God instead of doing this individually and staying silent and keeping quiet and staying to ourselves. Maybe we need to sing and cry out to God together and not worry about it and let God work on us that way. And so that's what we're going to do, is what he said to the people, us, ministry leaders in this room. He said, we're just going to stop what we're doing. I know I'm supposed to talk. I'm not going to talk anymore. You guys are going to talk to God, and we're just going to cry out to God together. And so he said, go. I was sitting next to my wife, and I started mumbling to God. And I heard mumbles, and I heard a few voices talking, and then things got a little bit louder. We were told to cry out to God as ministry leaders. Nobody's going to make fun of us, and yet all of us were quiet. And finally, I heard this voice, and it's going to get loud. I heard this voice across the room, and it pierces my ears. It's in my head right now still. A voice across the room saying, help me, God, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. We say worshiping God is going to change the world, and when we try to do it, we don't know how. We don't know how to let go and just give him the glory that he deserves. Right?
Amen.
It's a whole lot easier for me to cheer at a basketball game than it is for me to yell in front of you right now. This is the loudest I've ever been in church, guys. I'm just saying. Right? Right? And Jesus says that if we are united and we worship him, the world will be changed.
Amen.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to worship God. We're going to worship God, and we're going to let him have it. And it's hard. It is hard because people like me have taught you that worshiping God is something that you do quietly in your closet, and you don't lift your hands because it's crazy. And you don't cry out to God because you don't want people to look at you funny. But all the way back to the beginning, Jesus said, if you won't let me wash your feet, you have no part of me. It is time, guys. It's time to worship God as one body, united and unashamed.
So it's called Papa Vane Preacher is what it's called. So
did it pop up? Was it there?
So anyway, so I want to go full circle. If you go back to John chapter 13, Jesus said that the world will know that you are my disciples by the way you love one another. And another way that he prayed for that. And here's the thing, the moments before Jesus died, he was praying for you, and he was praying for you and I to be unified as believers.
Amen.
And I want to tell you a little bit about North Korea or South Korea right now. South Korea is sending missionaries to the United States. I'm just going to let that sit right there. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to go into a time of communion. In fact, as we close out our service, we call this a response time. Yeah. And we're gonna come and we are going to meditate and remember Jesus and what he did for us in his death, burial, and resurrection. And then in worship, we're just going to cry out to God.
Amen.
We're going to lay everything at his feet. And I'm going to just throw this out here today. Jesus prayed for unity. Maybe today, and there might even be somebody in this room, you just need to say, you know what, the past is the past. I'm going to let the past be the past, and I just want to be unified with you as a brother or sister in Christ. And if that person's not here, maybe you just need to make that decision to say, it is done. The unity of the church, the unity of the body is more important than how I feel. And offer that forgiveness today. Let's go to God. Father God, we thank you. Sometimes we don't even know how to pray, but your Spirit prays for us. So, Father, right now, I pray for two items: that we abide and that we passionately fight for unity within your body. And as we come and as we cry out today, Lord, I pray that we leave it all there. I pray this in the name that is above every name, Jesus. Amen.